Hello. Well, my name's June Collins and I currently live in Queensland, Australia. However, I have lived in many countries of the world and I came back here 20 odd years ago to retire. And I'm still going strong, so this is a pretty long retirement, more than I ever expected. I'm going to be 90 next May, so I never thought I'd be in Australia this long, or I might have stayed away a bit longer. Pretty much everything I've done in my life has been unusual, particularly for a woman of my era. Let's face it, when I started travelling, I was 22 years old. People were mostly still travelling by ship, and very few people were flying. And when I would go to Mascot Airport to fly overseas, half my family would show up to bid me farewell, because it was a big deal that somebody was flying or even going overseas. In those days, people didn't have as much money, so there weren't as many tourists in the world as there are now. In fact, I went to many places where I was the first white woman they'd seen.
Wow.
So it was quite a unique experience. When I headed out in the beginning, I was working as a dancer. And I lived for 7 years in Southeast Asia, and I've been to every country in Southeast Asia, and I've danced in most every country there too. Especially if I got out of the major cities and went out, like in Japan, for example, went out into the smaller towns. They'd often not seen a white woman before, and they would stare at me. And at one place, Kanazawa, I waited at a traffic light and a little old man walked up to me while I'm waiting, and I had a big blonde bouffant hairdo. He poked his finger in the hair and scratched my scalp as if to see if I was real. I didn't know what to do. And where I was staying in Osaka in a Japanese hotel, if you want the ofura, the bath, they didn't have any in the bedrooms. You had to go to the public toilets too, where I shared the toilets and the bathroom with men. When I went into the ofura, there were families there bathing, husband and wife and all their children. But me being the only white woman in there, I'd get undressed and there was nowhere else to get clean. I'm living there, I had to get clean. I felt like huddling up and crawling over to get into the water, and the water is hotter than hell. They just get in like it's nothing. I could barely get my toe into it and get into it. So because traveling in those days was so unique, I had lots of experiences that the tourists today wouldn't have. You didn't go into countries and find McDonald's everywhere. You didn't find people in Western dress everywhere. When I travel now, it's boring. Everywhere I go, it's westernized. People aren't wearing their traditional dress the way they used to. They've all got the McDonald's. They've all got the westernized things happening. So it's not half as mystical. It's not as different. We're getting all homogenized. I think it's boring, actually. I'm glad I lived when I did and had the incredible experiences I've had. I was living in Korea in the early 60s, and it was still very poor there because they hadn't recovered from the war that they'd had. And I lived there for a year, and I loved Korea and I loved the people, but they were so poor at night down in Seoul. They still didn't have electricity on in many parts. And a lot of people would come outside and cook their evening dinner in front of the buildings in their hibachis. And it would be all dark, but there'd be all these lights from all these fires where they were cooking their food outside. And a man used to go around on a horse and cart calling out in Hanguk. And he wanted to sharpen their knives and their scissors, and people would run out and he would sharpen their knives and their scissors. I mean, just a little trivial thing like that, but so different from the way that we live. I went back to Korea about 3 years ago now, and it's amazing. You wouldn't see it as today. It's so modern. It's so clean, so modern. You would never know it was the same country. But I still love the Korean people. And while I was in Korea, the war started up, or had already started, but it sort of exploded more while I was in Korea. And the Korean people didn't have much money, as I said, and their soldiers, the government paid for the military, and the government was so poor they didn't export then the way they do now. They didn't make cars or anything in those days. So their military was very poor, and sometimes their soldiers didn't get paid. The American government said to them, if you send some of your troops down, Republic of Korea, we call them ROKs, R-O-K, Republic of Korea. You send some of them down to Vietnam, we'll pay each man the same amount that an American soldier of the equivalent rank would be getting. Well, to these people, that was a fortune. So they were lining up and falling over each other to be in the units that were being sent down to Vietnam. When they were going to Vietnam, I didn't particularly want to go down, but an American liquor salesman who worked there in Okinawa, he said to me, I'm going down to set up a shop in the American commissary, which is a huge shop that sells to all the military in the country. And he said, I'm setting up a jewelry shop. And you've lived in Hong Kong and you know jewelry and you know where to buy it in Hong Kong. He said, if I hired a Vietnamese girls, would you come down and manage it and do the buying? So I said, yes, I would. And that's how I ended up in Vietnam. But I did not stay working for him for various reasons. That didn't last even a week. And I ended up flying to the Philippines, where I'd previously lived for a year. And I hired a bunch of Filipinos, men and women, and brought them all back to Vietnam. And I started putting Filipino rock bands into all the American army camps. I stayed there for 3.5 years, and I did that for 3.5 years. I don't know if I would have stayed much longer, but there was a lot of corruption going on. The American military, the NCO and enlisted men's camps were run by a group of sergeants. And I thought, geez, these Americans are dishonest. They're all making me pay a kickback to put my bands in there. So when they pay me, they take some of it back for themselves. I wasn't very happy about it. And then I talked to some of the other entertainer agents that were there, and they were telling me they had to pay too. And the salespeople that were putting chairs and tables in the clubs or selling them beer or selling them pub snacks, they all had to pay too. So I thought, this is unfair. So I went to the CID, Criminal Investigation Department, and I signed a statement telling all the names of all the crooked sergeants. I had no idea that they were a huge organised group that was so organised that even the Pentagon was sending their members, that part of the group, to each division to make sure each division was covered by one of them. And a major general, a 2-star general, was protecting them. So, of course, when they found out what I'd done, they wanted to get rid of me. It was a little bit of a scary time. They had a very high price on my head. But about that time in America, they were having Senate hearings, investigations into corruption in the military clubs in Vietnam. This was all happening at the same time. And 2 investigators came from America to Vietnam, and the CID agents who'd taken my report were honest people. In fact, the night that I gave the report, they'd come to my apartment in Saigon, and they said, can you pack a bag and get out quick? Do you have anywhere you can go? And they said when our report went on went into the office of the head of the military police. Major General Carl Turner was his name. We didn't know that this was an organised group and he's protecting them, and they all know now what you've done. Your life isn't worth anything. I had to get out immediately. But fate stepped in, and at the same time the United States Senate into Un-American Activities, the committee, they were looking into it. So these two investigators came out, and the two CID fellows knew where I was, and they put them in touch with me. And America paid to fly me to America then. And I made front page headlines in every single newspaper in America when I testified in the Senate, and this gang of crooks was totally destroyed. Some people call me a heroine. A lot of them called me other names. The ones that were related to these sergeants called me very bad names. Didn't like me at all. After I testified in the Senate about the crooked guys running the American enlisted men's clubs in Vietnam, I thought, I didn't expect all this to happen in my life. What now? I said, where do you go from here? I didn't know what next. I decided I'd write a story about that experience. And so I wrote the story. And when the American government took me over there, they sent me up in a hotel in Washington because I had to testify in Washington. But when it was all over, I moved up to New York, which is only an hour by plane up the road. So I went to a New York literary agent and I told him I've written my book, here it is, and everybody's read about me in the newspapers, so I'd like to publish this story. He looked at me and he said, forget it, nobody wants to read your story. He said, you may be news today. He said, but you're not a celebrity. Within a week you'll be forgotten. I don't want your story. Naturally, I felt quite humbled. But then I remembered that there was a movie I saw called The Green Beret. And I'd been friends with all the Special Forces troops when I was in Vietnam. And they all talked about the guy that wrote the book, The Green Beret, that the movie with John Wayne was made from. His name was Robin Moore. And I knew that he was an honorary Green Beret. And Martha Ray, the old movie actress, they made her an honorary Green Beret. And Green Berets had given me some sort of a medal, and to some of them I was like an honorary Green Beret, but not like them. But I thought they know who I am. So I'm going to call Fort Bragg, which was their headquarters, and ask them, how do I get hold of Robin Moore? So I put a call into whatever office, I don't recall, for the Special Forces in Fort Bragg. I said, I want to get hold of Robin Moore. Do you have the number? I said who I was. They knew who I was. They gave me his number and I called him. I said, do you know who I am? He said, yes. I said, they just rejected my book, the agent. I said, would you be interested in writing it with me? He said, I'd love to. He said, how do you feel about moving down to Jamaica to write it? He said, I keep a property I own down there called the Blue Lagoon. Yes, the one that was in the movie. It belongs to Robin Moore. He said, we'll go down there for a few months and write the book. He says, 2 houses on the property. He said, my wife and I'll live in one and you'll live in the other one. So we moved down to Jamaica and spent about 10 months down there writing the book. Actually, when the book was finished, we called it the Khaki Mafia by Robin Moore and June Collins. When it came out, it was a bestseller for quite a while. And in fact, we had 2 people try to make it into movies. We had 2 movie options on it. quite a bit of money had been invested in it already when, for various reasons, it fell through. And that's been one of the biggest disappointments of my life, that my movie story was sold and even started. Anne Margaret that's how I met her. She was going to play me in the movie. But one thing and another, it never got off the ground. So that was so disappointing. After I testified in the Senate, I went to live in Florida, and I bought a magnificent floating home that looked like a Japanese temple. And I lived very happily on that for 5 years. And during that time, I had my own TV talk show in Dania, Florida. Dania is between Fort Lauderdale and Miami. While I was doing that show, I happened to have a trip to Alaska, and I won't go into what that was about. It was a business trip. But I met a man there in Alaska, and he talked me into going to Alaska, but he asked me to marry him. And I had reached the point where I really wanted to adopt children from third world countries, because I'd traveled a lot and I'd seen starving children sleeping in the streets everywhere. I thought I'd take one off the street, but in those days I discovered a single woman could not adopt. So I wanted to get married just to adopt the children. And when I met this man from Alaska, he said, if you come up and spend a couple of years here in Alaska with me, leave Florida and come up here, if you help me with what I'm trying to do, he said, I'll help you adopt the child. I was very happy living in Florida. I mean, my TV talk show only required 1 day a week, and I'm having parties, and I've got all these celebrities coming, and this beautiful, big, magnificent floating home with a big rooftop deck where we had these beautiful parties under the stars, and it was an exciting life. I didn't want to go and leave it all and go to Alaska and live in the snow and ice and run a trucking company. But I really felt I had to give back, and I really felt I had to take one of those children, not a baby out of a hospital. I wanted a child that's been on the streets, that's had a hard life. So, as much as I didn't want to do it, I went to Alaska. No sooner got there than he said he was leaving me to run his trucking company, because he had to go to Hawaii, where he had bought this ship, because the trucking company was hauling drilling mud from Fairbanks up to Prudhoe Bay, and they were using the drilling mud where they were drilling for oil on the Alyeska pipeline, which was at that time the biggest pipeline in the world. Now, the ship he bought was an old World War II water carrier, and he was going to have it all reorganised to do the same thing. They were going to carry drilling mud in the tanks that had held the water. But I said, I know nothing about Kenworth trucks. I know nothing about cold weather. How am I going to do this? And he said, I don't trust anyone here. He said, I trust you. He said, I'll phone you every day and tell you what you've got to do. I'll phone every day and talk to the mechanics. And he said, I'll be running at long distance. And he said, I'll come fly in every other weekend and bring things up to date. He said, I'll be phoning every day. Well, he took off for Hawaii, and I hardly saw him for the next 6 months. And how I managed it, I don't know. One example, we had 2 Eskimo boys. We don't call them Eskimos, they're Aleut Indians. But anyway, we had 2 Eskimo young boys that were gophers. They'd run in and out of town to get our parts that we needed and so on, clean up the yard, do whatever needed. And all our trucks had a number on the side window. You've got a fleet of trucks, they're numbered. And they said to me, one of the drivers said to me, we've got a different number for this truck now. You need to get the old number off the window and put the new number on. I said, sure, I'll do that. And he gave me the number, and it's sort of sticky on the back. You just got to peel the other one off, put this one on. But I took the scissors because I thought I might need the scissors to cut the thing off the window, to scrape it off. I go out, the snow's up to your knees. I walk over to the truck, and of course they got a silver metal ladder down the side of the truck. So I've got the number in my hand and the scissors, and the metal is slippery because it's turned to ice. So I'm slipping going up the ladder. So I stick the scissors in my mouth so I could grab it better. And when I got to the top and I went to take the scissors out of my mouth, of course they'd stuck to my lip and there was no way I could get them off. Well, I guess I could have waited and gone inside and heated everything, but I didn't think. I panicked. I ripped the scissors out of my mouth and the whole top lip, the skin off the whole top lip came. Well, those two Eskimo boys were in the snow looking at me. They fell down in the snow. They fell on the ground laughing and pointing at me and screaming, "Chichako, Chichako," which apparently is meaning greenhorn, greenhorn. I'd like to say it was the only one experience I had like that, but there were a few. So that was a few years of hardship and hard work. But before I left, he finally got the ship working, and he sailed the ship back to Alaska. But when he got back to Alaska, the ship was going to service the offshore wells. They were also drilling offshore. The trucks were servicing the Alyeska pipeline, which is onshore. Then they found that the drilling they were doing offshore was no good. So here we paid all this money for this ship, and we spent 6 months changing it around, and suddenly there's no offshore drilling. So my husband says, "Oh, well, to hell with that. Going to sell the trucking company. We're going to go crab fishing. I'll turn it into a crabber." So then he decided to do that. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show The Deadliest Catch. Well, that's crab fishing for king crab. King crab are this big, average one's a metre. You can only do it in the middle of winter. The middle of winter in the Bering Sea, it's the most dangerous sea in the world. And the middle of winter, it's black all the time. 2 hours of daylight, and that's the only time you get king crab. So I said, "All right, it's dangerous, I hear. They say it's the most dangerous job in the world." "Yes," I said, "I hope you'll be safe. Goodbye. I'll see you when you get back." "What do you mean, goodbye? You're coming too." "What? You know, I want to go to the Bering Sea and fish crab in the middle of winter?" I said, "No way." He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "We have to have a cook. You have to come." And he said, "If you come, I promise we'll get the child after that." And I said, "I've had enough. I want to leave Alaska." He said, "I promise I'll take you down, find a home in Seattle, and we'll adopt the first child." He said, "I'll still work up here, but I'll go back and forth. A lot of the people, the seamen from Alaska, spend their out-of-season time in Seattle." He said, "We'll go to Seattle, we'll live there. You can live there and I will fly in and out of Alaska and still keep." So I agreed, and we sometimes were fishing within sight of Russia, but I learned to pray when I was on that fishing vessel. I can tell you, it's unbelievable, some of the experiences you go through. It is the most dangerous sea in the world, and anybody that fishes the Bering Sea, there's not an insurance company in the world that will insure you. Well, eventually we made it to Seattle, and as he said, he flew in and out. We lived at first on a beautiful property on a little island called Vashon Island. There's just a half an hour ferry ride across from mainland Seattle. And we went in and out by the ferry. Oh, it was so beautiful living there. It was paradise. But we adopted our first boy, a 6-year-old child from India. And when we'd had him, he didn't speak English, of course, but after he'd learned to speak English, about 6 or 8 months after he arrived, he said, Mum, he said, it's lonely here. He said, I had lots of school friends and friends in India. He said, I'm lonely here because we were living out in the country. So I put in to adopt another Indian son, also 6. So I got my second Indian son so he wouldn't be lonely. About a year or so later, I found out that 13 years old was the cut-off age to bring in the overseas children. The overseas children, if they're older, usually have been through so much trauma that the adoptions often disrupt. They don't work out. The children are so troubled that the people can't handle it and they give up. So it's very hard with the older children, and most people don't want to take that risk. But I was always a bit of a fool rushing in. So somebody phoned me and said, hey, there's a 13-year-old boy in Colombia and he was to be adopted, and all the paperwork was done and ready, and the parents that were to take him have fallen ill, and if he stays there another 2 months he'll be too old and he won't be able to be adopted. Would you take him? It's desperation time. I said yes. So I took a 13-year-old Colombian. Well, it's a long story. And after that, I won't go into it, it's too long-winded, but after that, 6 months later, I ended up with a 12-year-old Korean boy. And that was a lot of work because they were troubled children, especially the Korean boy. The Korean boy had been in a child prison camp, like a camp where they had to work. He was chained to a sewing machine and had to work 18 hours a day sewing and sleep on the floor at night beside the machine. So he was very messed up. So I wasn't going to take any more, and my husband was starting to get a bit edgy about it. But one day there was a knock on the door, and a social worker from outside of Seattle came in and said, we're very desperate. We've got a 3 and 4-year-old sister and brother. We need somewhere temporarily to put them. Their father's going into jail and the mother's incompetent and there's no one to take them. Oh, naturally I said I'd take them. But 2 years later, the situation hadn't improved and they were put up for adoption. By then they already called me Mum and I already felt like they were mine, so of course I adopted them. But at that point Doug said, my husband, if I ever come home and see another strange face at the dining room table, I am divorcing you. And he sounded like he meant it, and I was pretty exhausted by then anyway, so I quit at 6. George Barry owned Fabergé, which was a really huge company at the time. Still big, but not as big as it was then. And he owned an office building, a huge building, and every floor was luxury, and even the girls that ran the elevators wore the most beautiful, elegant uniforms. When I went into his private office to talk with him, he said, what would you like to drink? I looked around and it's all desks and bookshelves, and what would I like to drink? And I said, oh, it's a bit early, I'm not sure. Oh, he said, you must have a drink. I said, all right. He pressed a button and the whole wall slid away, and out slid out a bar with bar stools in front of it and very lifelike men and women sitting models on each of the bar stools. You would have sworn they were real people. So he then went and got me a drink. I mean, I was quite stunned. Later on, we left and went downstairs to his limousine, and when we got in the elevator, we got in one where there was a man running the elevator, not one of the girls. And he looked at the man and he said, how are you, John? The man said, good, thanks, Mr. Barry. He said, how's your mother? The last time I spoke to you, you said she was going into hospital. he was a real person. Even though he was a billionaire, he was a real person. I found that a lot over there, and with a lot of the movie stars I met too, not all of them, but with many of them, just down to earth, real people. Well, I met John Wayne, but he'd been drinking when I met him. I met him on his boat, actually, and we were in Mexico, and he was the most down-to-earth man you'd ever meet. But I had lunch with Anne Margaret, and she's absolutely a most quiet, charming, humble, the least arrogant person you could ever meet. And she was so beautiful. Her skin was like alabaster. I just adored her. On the other hand, I flew in George Barry's private jet one time, and Joan Collins wanted to hitch a ride with us. We were coming back from Mexico to New York, and she had a boyfriend with her, and I don't remember if it's one she married or not. She was very rude to all of us. There's only about 8 or 10 of us on the plane. She was so rude to all of us on the way back. She just was hugging and carrying on with the boyfriend the whole way. Quite rude and arrogant. I suppose I shouldn't say that, but she made a very poor impression. I've always liked jewellery, and I used to have jewellery when I was in show business in Asia. And my boyfriend owned the #1 jewellery shop in Kowloon. So I was able to buy magnificent jewellery from him at cost. And I made very big money as a dancer, and I had magnificent jewellery. And one time I kept it in a bank vault, and I went to pick it up. And in the middle of Pitt Street, Sydney, I was robbed. And it made the front page newspapers. It was $500,000 worth of jewellery. Made all the newspapers, was in the Sydney Daily Telegraph. And the police were investigating it, and I hired private detectives. And it turned out, the police and the private detectives, I think it was one of my old schoolmates that knew I was picking it up from the bank that day, and we had a follow, but they never found or recovered the jewellery, so they weren't able to charge her. That was all my money was in that. That's all the money in the world I had, and put all of it in the jewellery. I couldn't look at jewellery for years, and it was magnificent jewellery. Magnificent. I couldn't look at jewellery for years after. It made me actually feel like throwing up. And it made me not trust people too. And also it showed me jealousy, particularly among women. And I'd been starting to see jealousy in her and others that I'd gone to school with. And I was at the peak of my life then, travelling the world, wearing magnificent clothes. And these are people I went to school with, and they're working in the shop or in an office. And I was starting to feel the difference and divide between me and them. When I come back to Australia, I was gone most of the time, and I was feeling the jealousy coming in. And unfortunately, that made me lose a lot of trust. So I don't have a lot of trust. I've seen too often people that you love and trust can hurt you. It's sad, really, that the world can be that way. When I had all the children, I couldn't work much for a while until the older boys were reasonably capable of watching and babysitting the younger ones a little bit. I started doing a few flea markets. But what happened when I couldn't look at jewellery after the big robbery, but I'm talking 25 years later now, I started to think, well, I could buy costume jewellery. And in America, there's beautiful costume, not the cheap junk we get here from China, but they have beautiful costume jewellery from the 40s and 50s, designer pieces with the names on them, collectible. And I took an interest in it, and I had a girlfriend who made a living buying and selling it, and she said she'd teach me. And she did. and she had a big shop in one of the malls there. Well, I didn't have enough money then to have a big shop, but I started doing it just on weekends in the flea markets because I had a couple of little children. But the flea market there had a park in it. So I was able to take them and watch them while they played and eventually after about a year, I decided I was going to go bigger and open a shop, and I ended up opening, I opened 3 shops total in downtown Seattle in the end. One of them was magnificent. Totally magnificent. I sold more than jewelry. I sold homewares and beautiful clothing. I sold everything. It was the shop with the 7 staff, so obviously it sold everything, had everything. I loved doing it too. I really enjoyed it. It was a bit hard handling all the children and the shop, but my shop had a big apartment out the back part of it. So the children could go and sit out there and watch TV and do colouring books, the little ones, while I worked. And the bigger ones could come in and help the lady in the kitchen or come and help work in the shop. So I could keep the kids in the shop. When I came here at first, I didn't do anything, just we travelled. I hadn't lived in Australia for 40 years. I'd been in and out, but quick trips in and out. So the 2 children had come on holidays here, but we didn't really know Australia at that point. Everything seemed I had to learn to drive on the wrong side of the road. I mean, I learned to drive in America. It was all hard. It was like being in a foreign country, even I grew up here. So we travelled around a bit, seeing the place. And I had all this jewellery left from when I sold the shop in America. I still had a lot of inventory left, mainly the jewellery. I got rid of everything else. So I thought, I heard about the antique shows here. And the first one I heard about was Jimmy Johnson's in Sydney, in the Horden Brothers building. That was an annual event. I went there and I did very well, although the jewellery I had was American vintage costume jewellery. And in Australia, they weren't used to it. And my pieces ranged in price from $500 up to $2,000 or $3,000 for a set. Well, they weren't used to that type of jewellery here. They thought it was real. When I said it wasn't real, they didn't understand the price. So that was a bit hard. But I then went down and did some shows in Melbourne as well. So in Sydney and Melbourne, it was okay. But when I tried to go out to the country towns, like I moved up to Queensland. When I went into the smaller towns, the people couldn't understand and wouldn't pay such big prices for costume jewellery because out here they don't know it. In America, they really know it and follow it. So I ended up going back to America and taking it all back and selling it to the different dealers over there. But I didn't want to just be a housewife either and a mother, even though I had enough children in the end and was busy enough. But that's never been enough for me. I always want to do more. So I decided I would sell more affordable jewellery. And then I decided I'd get a shop because it's more stable than travelling to the antique shows all the time. So I ended up with a shop. As I've got older, I didn't want to work 7 days a week, so I stopped doing that, I think, when I was 85. I decided that was enough time to quit 7 days a week. Now I just do an occasional show because I don't have a lot left. But I'm hating the boredom of retirement. And I have been 3 times volunteered to work in different places as a volunteer. I never felt like I fitted in. I haven't found my niche in retirement. I'm bored. I'm used to a real full, busy life. I was learning to fly a plane when I was in Florida. And the day before I was to solo, I was flying with my instructor, and we were flying low over the Everglades. And suddenly the radio went berserk, and person on the other end said, clear the space, clear the space, clear the space, urgent, urgent. And my teacher said, let me take the controls. Quickly he took the controls, and I looked out the window, and it was the biggest plane crash in America's history. A commercial airliner had just crashed below me in the Everglades. And I looked out the window, and there's the plane all broken up with the wing here, and the body here, and a wing there. And I could see the bodies, and I could see the suitcases, and all. And I'm flying very low, and then the air's filled with helicopters, and it's all frantic. And my instructor's taken the controls, and he's getting us out of there. But I'm looking. The next morning, I lost my confidence. And I didn't go back and solo, and I never got my plane license. And I've always two things I've regretted. My movie was never made. It's my biggest regret. And the other one, I never got my plane license. But in May, 4 months away, when I turn 90, I'm having a party back at Mount Tambourine, and I'm going to do a tandem hang glide off the mountain. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. I mean, it's no big deal. I'm not jumping solo, I'm just tandem, but at least it'll put a bit of wind in my sails, hopefully. I've always wished I'd been an anthropologist.
Yeah.
Don't waste your teenage years. Whatever you want to do, start young. If you can start at 13 or 14, I mean, you're still going to school, but if you can start, I just recently read a thing on a magazine, and there was a young boy, 12, lived near a golf course, and he went out and picked up dozens and dozens of golf balls, stray golf balls, and he went on the internet and he sold them very quickly. Then he started going to garage sales. Today he's 14. He's bringing in a 6-figure income every year at 14. I don't think you're ever too young to start. Don't wait and say, oh, I'm 21, I'll wait till I'm 24, I'll wait till I'm 21. Get into it early. Don't be a sheep. Too many people believe everything they see on TV. Too many people believe everything they hear. You have to check things out where you should. If your doctor tells you, take a medicine for a particular illness you might have, get on Google and have a look and try and find out. Well, death is scary because nobody wants to leave, well, very few people want to leave what they have here. Even if their life is miserable, they want to hang on to it because they don't know what next. They think either it's nothing or it might be worse. So people are scared of death. I'm not particularly scared of death. I think it's a very sad thing when we lose our mother, when we lose a child. It's very heartbreaking. And I, unfortunately, saw too many young men killed in Vietnam. And it feels like they were so cheated. It's a terrible feeling. But I personally don't have a great fear of death. I don't believe that there's nothing. And I don't believe there's anything to be scared of. Well, for me, I don't feel there's anything to be scared of. Some people might feel differently.